I just see a sort of lower expectations, particularly for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. And I began to understand this ideology in education. And I came to the view over those 5 years that the degree to which the school was progressive was the degree to which the school would have poor standards, particularly for the most disadvantaged pupils.
Hello and welcome. My name is Glenn Fahey. I'm the Director of Education here at the Centre for Independent Studies. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here today for I'm sure will be a fantastic discussion and I think very insightful for Australian education systems. Despite the many years that we've been working in education research and policy, we've known that there are many serious problems across education systems in Australia. Student outcomes in Australia have suffered the steepest and most consistent declines in the Western world, other than in Finland, once described as the utopia for education systems around the world. The toll that plays is not just one that you see on a chart, and we might see some charts today, I'm sure, but it's not the cost of that is in human life and in the opportunities available to young people. Australia has some of the most disruptive classrooms in the world. The toll of that is not just in lost learning time in Australian classrooms, but also children that suffer from bullying and really damaging impacts on well-being. We know many Australian teachers aren't classroom ready when they graduate from their degrees. The cost of that is deeply impactful of their experience in the profession. Our research, though there are many problems in education, our research is always focused on where there are solutions. And as a public policy think tank, we generally are looking between what the evidence says and how that can inform good policy. And there are few more places in the world that have provided a clearer direction for us than in the United Kingdom and especially in England. Over recent years, for those who have followed our work and attend our events often here in this room, would have heard from many influential educators and researchers and policymakers from the English school system. That's included, in this room 2 years ago, in fact, Britain's strictest headmistress, Catherine Birbalsingh, talking about the role that managing classrooms and having high expectations for children plays in transforming outcomes in disadvantaged school in northwest London. We've heard from Tom Bennett, who's talked about the role of transforming student behaviour and the role that plays in improving well-being and teacher efficacy in classrooms. And we've heard from Amanda Spielman, the head of the Ofsted program, which is effectively a regulator of the education system, about the role of high standards at the very top of a system, transforming all the elements across the entire system. And today we'll be hearing from the person who's really been at the top of all of that. Nick Gibb has been the schools minister for more than a decade in the UK and particularly governing the school system in England. And it's no surprise that in the time that the English school system reform has been underway, students' results have begun to improve, reversing a trend of decline, which Nick will talk to. As those of us here at CIS that investigate good policy, we very much admire the work that Nick and his team have done over many years, and I'm so glad to have the opportunity to have Nick here in Australia sharing his lessons and for education policy reform. So please welcome back to the CIS, Nick Gibb.
Thank you very much, Glenn. It's a pleasure to be here. I was here 7 years ago and worked with John Gardner in South Australia at that time as well. If this was a sermon, which it is not, you'll be pleased to know, then I would start it by saying my text today is the 1976 speech, the Ruskin College speech, by the Labour Prime Minister James Callaghan. He started his speech by explaining how criticised he had been as Prime Minister, even to be making a speech about education in 1976. It became known as the Secret Garden speech because he was criticised for daring to enter the secret garden of education policymaking as a politician. In that speech, he hinted at the problems that the country was facing with our education system. From 1964 to 1970, this is 12 years before the Ruskin College speech, there have been some dramatic, very significant reforms to English, UK education by the Labour government that came in 1964, and Anthony Crosland introduced a whole raft of changes. That then led to an increase in poor behaviour. There was a lot of debate, spearheaded by the Black Papers, they were called, and people were very worried about A, behaviour, and B, falling standards in our schools. And James Callaghan really started the debate in our country about why the standards started to fall from the late 1960s onwards. I also mention James Callaghan because he's Labour and I am not. And one of the key driving principles I have always held about this agenda, about evidence-led approach to education policy, is that it can't be right or left. Some of the greatest proponents, most articulate supporters of the agenda that Michael Gove and I introduced from 2010 onwards have been on the left. Some of them indeed are paid-up members of the Labour Party. And if you want to bring a whole profession with you, you need to make sure that you're not associating these reforms necessarily with the right of politics. I've always tried to steer clear of that debate. So in opposition, between 2005 and 10, we were concerned about the decline in English education. I became an MP in 1997, and I started visiting schools. And in the secondary schools, they were telling me that 50% of the pupils starting at that school had a reading age below their chronological age, and a quarter had a reading age 2 years or more below their chronological age. And I really didn't understand this at all. My mother was a primary school teacher. All her children, starting in her class in year 2, had a reading age above their chronological age. We were also worried about this. So these are the PISA rankings. So we were in opposition really between these 2 years. So we were 7th, 8th and 4th in reading, maths and science. But then we were declining to 17th, 24th and 14th. And then by 2009, we were 25th in reading, 28th in maths and 16th in science. More countries had joined the PISA survey during that period. But nevertheless, this was a downward trajectory, and we were very worried about it. And I wanted to know why. So I started visiting schools every Monday for 5 years, and then beyond when I was a minister, in those opposition years between 2005 and 2010, speaking to teachers, trying to understand the debates in education. What were they doing in the schools? And I did notice, I just see sort of lower expectations, particularly for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. And I began to understand this ideology in education. And I came to the view over those 5 years that the degree to which the school was progressive was the degree to which the school would have poor standards, particularly for the most disadvantaged pupils. So I met a lady called Ruth Miskin in 2003, and she explained to me the whole debate about phonics versus whole language teaching. And I identified immediately that this was one of the things that is an example of progressive education. I was trying to understand what I meant by progressive education. I knew it when I saw it, but I wasn't able to articulate it in the way that perhaps all of us here in this room can today. And so she explained that the whole debate between whole language teaching or multi-cueing and phonics, which was learn the sounds of the alphabet, the 44 sounds that the English alphabet produces, how to blend them into words, k, at, cat. Whereas what the system was in England, following the National Literacy Strategy, was this multi-cueing, a bit of phonics for the first letter, grammatical context, story context, even the picture context. All these cues were to be used to try to help the child identify the word. And Ruth Miskin explained to me how this just does not work. It involves too much thinking. What you need to do is to be able to effortlessly decode words, and that's what the teaching should be principally about. She introduced me to the Clackmannishire study. So this is a study, I think it started in the late 90s, in a small local authority in Scotland, where they took 300 pupils, they divided them up into 3 groups. The first group would be taught reading using a systematic approach, synthetic phonics approach. The other 2 groups used a kind of combination of analytical phonics and the kind of approach to reading that was happening in our schools in England. After 16 weeks, the synthetic phonics group had a reading age 7 months ahead, a word reading age, 7 months ahead of their actual age, and 7 months ahead of the other two groups. So they had to put all three groups into the synthetic phonics group. This is the academics from Hull University and St Andrews University, followed them for 7 years. And at the end of that period, they had a reading age, those children had a reading age 3.5 years ahead of their chronological age, a spelling age 1 year, 9 months ahead of their chronological age, and a comprehension reading age 3.5 months ahead of their chronological age. The comprehension thing is another issue I might talk about later, why that's lower than the other two things, because it depends on a lot more than just decoding. It depends on general knowledge and vocabulary. So we then, when we came into office in 2010, decided that we made this a big issue in the election that we were going to introduce phonics, and we changed the national curriculum, requiring primary school teachers to use synthetic phonics in the teaching of reading. We changed the teachers' standards. This is the standards that trainee teachers have to reach to qualify. We simplified those, and we made it a requirement that any primary school teacher had to be able to teach reading using systematic synthetic phonics. We got Ofsted, the inspectorate. We changed their framework so that when they inspected a primary school, they would listen to the weakest readers read. And we did this. We introduced the phonics screening check. So this is a test for 6-year-olds, very controversial. You don't test 6-year-olds, I was told. This is a one-to-one test between the child and the teacher, so no pressure really on the child. There are 40 words, and as soon as the child starts struggling, then the test stops for those children. Of the 40 words, 20 of them are made-up words. They're not real. These aren't real words. Not even in Australia are these real words. And the purpose of this is to ensure that children are taught to decode. And the little pictures of a monster is to prevent the child from trying to find real words from them. So this is a monster, and his name is Gax. And again, we asked a group of teachers what the pass mark should be, and they said 32 out of 40. I thought that was very high. So we asked another panel of teachers, and they came up with the answer of 32 out of 40. So we had to have that as the pass mark. So we piloted it in 2011. Only 33% of children reached that mark. It went out for real and was compulsory in all schools in 2012. 58% of children were able to reach that expected standard in 2012. Over the years, we gave some funding for schools to introduce phonics schemes, to train their teachers in using phonics. So over the years, it increased year on year on year. And then, in fact, we may even have a slide that shows that. There we go. Year on year, it increased up to about 82. It's kind of plateaued at 82. It dipped then with the COVID. It's now come back since COVID. It's gone up to 79 the following year, and this year it was 80%. So we're getting back to where we were. But just before COVID, it had reached 82%, reaching the expected standard in the phonics screening check, and it's real. If you go to any primary school now in England, you will see phonics teaching being taught. Every teacher now teaches phonics to those young children, which they did not do before 2010. I mean, there are variable standards. There are lots of schools getting 100%. And my desire is to get this figure up to 100%. If they fail the test in year one, the children have to retake it in year two. If you include the year two results, it's up to about 91 or 92%. So my view is if you can get to 92% by year two, you can darn well get to 92% by year one. And if you can get to 92%, you can darn well get to 95%. So we did a lot more since then to try and train schools to make sure that they are teaching phonics in the most effective way. We are now 4th in the world in the international survey PEARLS. And they attribute that to our focus on phonics. And what's great about the PEARLS results, what's not great about the PEARLS results is that we're 4th behind Singapore, Hong Kong, and Russia. But what's great about the PEARLS results is that our score rose from the previous PEARLS 5 years earlier, 2016, because of the weakest readers. And that is very, very pleasing that it's those children who've been helped the most with this policy. So on to maths. Well, we looked around the world because we were worried about maths as well as reading. And because you saw those original slides, we were falling in maths as well. We looked to the people at the top of the PISA table, Singapore, Shanghai. We adopted the 2007 Singapore primary curriculum in maths, I essentially photocopied it. But then you had to consult. And that sort of brought in some things that, ideally wouldn't have been in there. But it's still a very much better curriculum than it was before. And we introduced the concept of maths mastery. So this is where children really do understand what they're being. They gain fluency and effortless fluency in the algorithms, how to carry the one and all those things. But at the same time, they're acquiring a deep understanding of the mathematics they're learning. And they spend, in Shanghai and Singapore, they spend weeks and weeks on a simple 2 digits by 2 digits. So it's like, I saw an example lesson of 70 times 30. And the teacher said, 70 times 30, so what's step 1? Throw away the zeros. What are you left with? 7 times 3. What's 7 3s? 21. How many zeros did you throw away? 2. How many zeros did you pick up? 2. So it's 21 plus 2 zeros, 2,100 is the answer. So and I watched the children doing other examples of 2 digits ending in zeros, and every single child in the classroom was getting it. That's not the approach I saw when I was visiting schools around the country. They would be too rapid in explaining an algorithm to children. Then they'd move on to some other type of method of doing that same calculation. And you could just see the children were just not getting it. So maths mastery is really important. The other thing about maths mastery is that it's whole class teaching, and that every child in that class, even in a mixed ability class in primary school, will be taught the same material. What was happening in our schools is that the children on the blue table, they weren't doing long division, and they never would do long division. And that's unacceptable, because long division, every child is capable of long division and adding and dividing and multiplying fractions. It just takes some children a little bit longer. But with direct instruction and good teaching, they're all capable of doing so. So we also introduced the multiplication tables check. That took a bit longer because it's computer-based. I believe very strongly that children need to know their tables, but automatically. And I'll come to some of the academic research behind all that. But they didn't really know the tables. I used to quiz children in year 6 when I was visiting schools, and a few hands went up, but not every hand went up. And so we wanted to introduce a test, and we changed the curriculum. Before, it was 10 times 10 you had to learn by year 6, by age 11. We moved it forward to age 9 and to 12 times 12, because there are 12 hours on a clock and 12 months in a year, all kinds of 12s. And so we introduced it. It only became final in 2020, compulsory in 2022. You have 6 seconds to answer each question, the 25 questions, multiplication tables questions. And in 2022, 27% of children in the country achieved full marks. And the average mark was 20-point-something correct answers on average. And if you go around primary schools in England today, all those hands will go up if you ask them, even the hard ones like 1111s, which you all know is 121. We rose from 27th in maths in PISA in 2009. We then were up to 17th in 2018, and we were 11th in PISA in 2022. So we're now going up those international league tables rather than down, and it's going up is the plan. So then we come to what I would say is the most important issue in school curriculum after reading and maths, and that is knowledge. And a key book that influenced me is this book, The Schools We Need and Why We Don't Have Them. So I took this on holiday to read on the beach in South Carolina, and at first didn't read it because I was reading a nice novel, but my other half read it and said I had to read it, and I did. And really it helped me properly understand what I meant when I said to myself that progressivist or progressive education is the cause of England's decline in international league tables. It was like a Rosetta Stone that explained, precisely what I meant, and it confirmed my other hunch that progressivism is not only damaging English education, it's particularly damaging the children from the most disadvantaged families. So what I learned on that beach, particularly, is Hirsch says that knowledge builds on knowledge like Velcro. The more you have, the more you know, the more you can know. So those children who possess intellectual capital, knowledge, when they first arrive at school, have the mental scaffolding to catch hold of what is going on, and they can turn that new knowledge into yet more mental Velcro to gain yet still more knowledge. But those children who arrive at school, he said, lacking the relevant experience and vocabulary, fall further and further behind. So for England, which at that stage had a primary school curriculum containing really minimal knowledge, they called it topic. You might spend a whole term, half term on chocolate or water or something, but it wasn't a systematic, proper sequence knowledge curriculum. And the secondary curriculum, when we came into office in 2010, was a competence-based curriculum that was introduced by the Qualification and Curriculum Authority in 2007. That was hugely damaging. Both those approaches to knowledge, both in primary and secondary, were hugely damaging to those children from disadvantaged backgrounds. And there's another slide. Yeah, this is the actual book I took to the beach, and it's full of notes and notation inside it. And I used it was on my desk the whole time as a minister, and civil servants got used to seeing it. But Hirsch goes on to say that it's not just any old knowledge that matters. He says that knowledge. He says it has to be the knowledge which constitutes the shared intellectual currency of the society, so that all can contribute to that national conversation. What Michael Oakeshott referred to as the ongoing conversation of mankind. I was then introduced to the work of Daniel Willingham. That's his first edition of his book, Why Don't Students Like School? That builds on the work of John Sweller, who's, I'm pleased to say, is here today, and I've managed to meet him today, which is wonderful, about cognitive load. And so this book helped me understand that short-term memory can only hold about 5 or 6 pieces of new information. If I were to give you 3 phone numbers, you might remember them. If I were to give you 25 phone numbers, 0 chance you'll remember them unless you're, particularly gifted or something. But if you want to be able to think critically or solve complex problems, you need extensive factual knowledge on which you can draw, and you need that stored in your long-term memory. And as Hirsch points out as well, these higher order skills in critical thinking, problem solving, creativity, actually come from the acquisition of knowledge rather than the other way around. And Hirsch wrote, he says, paradoxically, adequate attention to the transmission of broad general knowledge actually does lead to general intellectual skills. The paradox, he says, is quite stunning. The US education system's emphasis on formal skills has resulted in students who are deficient in formal skills, whereas an appropriate emphasis on transmitting knowledge results in students who actually possess the skills that are sought by American educators, skills such as critical thinking and learning how to learn. So now, I felt, as a new minister coming into office in 2010, I was equipped with those arguments and was able to take on and resist those people who said children don't need knowledge, they can just Google it and find out. I was able to resist those who argued that what matters are that children can think critically, problem solve, and be creative. That's what matters, not knowledge. And those who said that today's children will have jobs that don't yet exist, so today's knowledge is redundant. I now felt equipped to challenge and resist the siren voices that made those arguments, which superficially always appear compelling. And don't forget, in 2010, when we were embarked on our reform process with Michael Gove, to introduce phonics and to introduce a knowledge-rich curriculum and abolish our competence-based curriculum, we had no PISA study or Pearl study to demonstrate that our reforms would work. We had to rely solely on the strength of our arguments, bolstered and underpinned by Hirsch and Willingham and John Sweller and others, and by the strength of our convictions. And we were attacked remorselessly by the vested interests in the sector, particularly the early years lobby. Open letters were written to major newspapers opposing the phonics screening check, and even opposing funding for schools to have better training of phonics and to buy phonics materials. And even in 2022, open letters signed by 100 teachers criticising our focus on phonics and calling for a wider range of approaches to the teaching of reading. But the big advantage we had in office is that was the Prime Minister. We had the backing of David Cameron, he was Prime Minister in England between 2010 and 2016, who supported us and who backed Michael Gove and me all the way. And he totally understood the reforms that we were introducing and why they were so important. So in 2011, we started the process of actually reforming the national curriculum as well. And we appointed a panel of trusted experts who we knew based their approach on evidence. And by 2013, it was ready. and it became compulsory in 2014. New SATs, the end of primary school tests, were introduced in 2016. Again, they were criticised because there was a dip in performance, and we were criticised for failing half the children in the country because of those harder tests. But in the years that followed, those results started to rise as well. And we also took back control of the content of our public examinations, the GCSEs and the A-levels. These are taken at 16 and 18, and they are qualifications for young people. David Cameron had made an important speech about arm's-length bodies when we were in opposition. He basically said that any arm's-length body that currently does policy matters or administration had to be moved into the department with decisions taken by ministers accountable to Parliament. If it was a regulatory matter, like the results of exams and so on, then that would be a matter for an arm's-length body because it needed to be taken out of the political process. Our curriculum, until that point, had been determined by the Qualifications and Curriculum Authority. They were the people that introduced a competence-based curriculum. I felt they were out of control. They weren't really accountable to anybody, even the Labour ministers and the previous government. So we basically abolished the Qualification and Curriculum Authority. And if we just go back to that, we wanted evidence to be at the core of everything that we did. So with £137 million, we endowed this new organisation that we established called the Education Endowment Foundation. And they spent that £137 million with interest over 10 years to conduct randomised control trials and to determine the most effective, their mission, their essay question was to determine the most effective ways to help improve teaching, particularly for the most disadvantaged students. And we also had strong accountability measures as well, and we introduced a grammar and spelling test, again, and children were tested at the end of primary school. And finally, I just wanted to touch on the structural changes that we made as well. So we were worried about this progressivist ideology that, thanks to Hirsch, Willingham, Sweller, Rosenshine, others, we now properly understood. That progressivist ideology was powerfully entrenched in the universities, but also in the local authorities that directly ran our schools, our 23,000 schools. So we borrowed from the charter movement in the States and the free schools program in Sweden, and we encouraged schools to become academies. And these are essentially independent schools, but fully funded by the government through a contract between the trustees of the school, and the legal entity of the school, and the Secretary of State. And it meant that they would be free of the influence of local authorities. And we hoped that that autonomy that we gave schools would drive evidence-led approaches to teaching. And now 80% of secondary schools are now academies, essentially charter schools, and 40% of primary schools are now essentially charter schools. And we legislated so that any new school, and we had an increase in our pupil population by about 1 million in that period, any new school had to be a free school, essentially an academy run by a sponsor. And there are now 650 free schools, including the school that you mentioned, run by Catherine Birbal Singh, which is now the best school in the country in terms of its Progress 8 score, and indeed in terms of its absolute results as well. 50% of their grades at Michaela. You may not understand our grading system. In GCSEs, they go from 1 to 9, whereas 9 is the top grade, equal to an old A star star. Only about 5% of children get a 9. At Michaela, 50% of the children get 9s. And this is, 50% of the grades are grade 9s at that school, and 84% are 7, 8, or 9, which is all A grades. 84% all A grades in that school, and a third of the children at that school are eligible for free school meals in a very disadvantaged part of North London. And if you look at the top schools, these are the top schools. Most of those schools, not all of them, but most of them are. This is Progress 8. So Progress 8 is a sort of, the average school is a 0 progress. It's what a children of a similar background will have it at primary. If you're acting in the way most, you get a 0. If you're doing really well, you get something above 1. There's Catherine Birbal Singh's school, an astonishing. I didn't know it went up to this high. I didn't know it went to 2.37, and I think it's even higher this year. And so most of these schools on that list are free schools established really since 2010. I just want to touch on one more thing. and that is that some of our fiercest critics were from the devolved administrations. In the United Kingdom, we have 4 nations, as you know: Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and England. It's devolved. Education's a devolved matter. So I only was doing England, but we were really criticised by people in Scotland and Wales, both of which bluntly refused to follow the the approach we were taking with our reforms. They were quite snooty about really what we were doing. And Scotland actually went the other way and introduced a curriculum for excellence, which is an outcomes-based, competence-based curriculum, and that downplays knowledge. And Wales then soon after also introduced a similar approach to the curriculum. And both curriculum, so the Scottish one, for example, it talks about this very high level, the Scottish curriculum, and it refers to experiences and outcomes, achievements, objectives, descriptions of learning, areas of learning. And this means that teachers aren't really clear what they're meant to be teaching. And in the words of Lucy Crean, a journalist who's written extensively about this, she said that removing the knowledge from the curriculum framework removes the scaffolding that supports teachers in planning a coherent curriculum. And she points out, when the curriculum contains only high-level, somewhat ambiguous statements, which is the essence of a competence-based curriculum, it leads to variation, she says, in interpretation that doesn't only lead to differences in taught content, but to different standards in different schools. And here's the most damning indictment of that approach that Wales and Scotland have taken to their curriculum. Again, in the words of Lucy Crean, she says, one of the strongest predictors of what children will learn is what they already know. Children and adults need to connect new learning to something they already know in order for it to be meaningful. We therefore have a moral obligation to ensure, through the design of coherent national curriculum frameworks, that even and especially our most disadvantaged students have the prior knowledge they need to link their new learning. So in effect, and much to my sadness, we have in the United Kingdom a natural randomised control trial between England on the one hand and Scotland and Wales on the other. And here are the interim results. So you can see these are the PISA rankings. So we've gone up from, as I said, 25th in 2009 in England, rather than to 13th in reading, to 11th in maths. And then you look, there's the reading is, I don't quite understand the reading in Scotland, but if you look at the other thing, look at the maths, gone down to 30th. And then in Wales, reading, maths, science, all on a downward trajectory. The reading in 2018, 2022, we don't quite understand, because Scotland doesn't take part in PEARLS. They pulled out. They don't take part in TIMS. They are going to rejoin in 25, 26, and we'll find out really what's going on there. I like to think that they were listening to our phonics debates across the border, but you can see what's happening in the knowledge-based curriculum science. Look at that 30th, and maths down to 30th position in the world. And now the reform movement is growing internationally, and thanks to the brilliant work of the Centre for Independent Studies, to Glenn Fahey, to his predecessor, Jennifer Buckingham, to the former Education Secretary in Australia, Simon Birmingham, and to Stephen Marshall, the Prime Minister of South Australia, and to John Gardner, the Education Secretary in South Australia. We are seeing real reform happening in this country too, and knowledge. The debate now is taking off in Australia, and I'm very excited about what's happening in this country. It's great to be here again, and I think Australia is about to do what we did in England. And also thanks to Erica Stanford and Michael Johnson, we're seeing it emerging in New Zealand. In the United States, George Bush Jr. and Jeb Bush in Florida, the AEI, Robert Pondicio, David Steiner in New York, and now at the Johns Hopkins University, of course, and the huge impact of the Emily Hanford podcasts about reading Sold a Story. If you haven't heard those podcasts, for goodness sakes, go and listen to them. You will love them. They're really good. And she's had a massive impact right across the United States in terms of how reading is taught, and there's things happening in Sweden and even in Belgium. So thank you very much for listening to me. I hope we have a nice discussion, and I hope we can all work together to bring this even further in Australia. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick, and thanks everyone for being here today again. Nick, I wanted to maybe start the conversation with you around the sort of thing, more from a politician's perspective here, in that many people like to think, especially politicians like to think, that everything looks great in education because you're often visiting schools, you're talking to many people in your constituency as parents that would like to think everything's great, because people, when they ask about education, generally say something along the lines of, my school's wonderful, but though they might accept that schools at large may have problems. How do you go about convincing people that there is in fact a problem that needs to be solved?
I think people were worried in Britain about standards generally. Employers were complaining that school leavers at 16 weren't numerate. They couldn't, calculate, and they couldn't write properly. Universities were complaining that undergraduates were coming into university not as well prepared as previous generations were. So there was a problem that was being identified, even if particular parents, thought their local school was good. The body politic, the debate, was that there was a problem. And then we had, of course, the international league tables show there was a problem, that we were declining in those tables. So we did have a justification for wanting to be quite radical in terms of our approach to education reform. And
so you took the burning platform then, the need to change something. Many people will look at that problem in politics and say that the problem is that they'll have a solution in mind. So they might be saying, well, the major problem is intergenerational poverty. So we need to solve intergenerational poverty so then we can fix education. Or they might say that there's not enough funding in the system, therefore we fix funding in the system, then we'll fix the problem. It sounds to me that you identified a different sort of pathway or causation into the problem. How did you get to that conclusion and not maybe one of the conclusions that others often come to?
Well, I suppose I was at school between 1965, I'm really old, and 1978. And so that coincided almost exactly with the reforms introduced by the Labour government between 1965 and 70. And then there's always a time lag in education. And then gradually got those reforms, bad reforms, became entrenched in the 70s and 80s. And I kind of experienced some of that. I went to 7 different schools, including a school in Canada, because my father was a civil engineer. So I kind of saw some of this thing as a child. And there were all the black paper debates in the 70s that I was aware of. So I knew there was something. So there was that kind of bedrock of understanding. And then when I visited schools, I just saw very low expectations. And I saw an overemphasis. I saw some schools had hair salons because they wanted to train, mostly girls, to be hairdressers, which is not a highly paid profession. I'm nothing against people going into hairdressing. There's some very successful people who made very good careers from that industry. It's a very important industry. But I didn't understand why we were training 12-year-olds to cut hair when they were struggling with their academic study. And I saw a lot of that around the place. And I just saw standards in too many schools that I knew were way below where they should be. And it's just visiting schools, having discussions with the head teacher about why they were doing the things they were doing, that I really came to the view that actually there's something very wrong with the ideology and the philosophy of education in our country. And then I came across the phonics issue, and I knew that was an example of progressive education, this idea you didn't need to bother learning all those sounds and how to blend them. You could just pick it up by osmosis, by being exposed to high-frequency words, look, John, look, Janet, look. So I knew that was an example of progressive education. I thought mixed ability teaching in secondary school was an example, but I couldn't go any further. In fact, I even went to see the Labour Secretary of State when they were in power, and I said to Charles Clarke, I said, you've got to sort out progressive education. It's causing all these problems. And he said, well, what do you mean by that? And I couldn't really articulate it properly until I read Hirsch. And then I was able to do that. So I got to where I got. So there's all those issues that you talk about, funding and children's background, they all, of course, have an impact. But, everyone, I can't say this in public, but everyone, we do fund our schools quite well in the UK. We're the 5th largest economy in the world, and we fund them above the OECD average. Of course, we'd like more. Obviously, we'd like more. But an education system, and the background of children should be irrelevant in an education system. And the most successful education systems, that SES background, the children can overcome it. in successful education systems. That link between disadvantaged background and outcomes is not eradicated totally, but is reduced in jurisdictions, in countries that have a really highly effective education system. And I wanted us to have that kind of education system.
And you've been described as being obsessed with phonics. I don't know if that's meant to be an insult or credit to you. I'm not quite sure. But what made you obsessed with phonics as being the driver of all of that?
Well, because reading is not just a subject. It's the fundamentals to everything. You even do better in maths if you can read properly. And so for children that can't read, I remember meeting an electrician in my constituency. He was above average intelligent guy, 30 years old, very successful business he had. He told me in the surgery he couldn't read. I just thought, well, this is terrible. Why, how come a man like that can't read when he's clearly intelligent and successful? It didn't make any sense to me. And then I remember I went to visit a school in North London just before the election, and I was going there to see some volunteers. There was a volunteer reading scheme. I was going there to see it. And they had this girl, she was 9 years old, and she wasn't particularly bright, but they were giving her this book to read with the words like Tyrannosaurus Rex in it. And she was really struggling to read anything, really struggling. And eventually she got this word, even, and there was rejoicing, And I said, well, do you mind if I just cover up the first letter? I covered up the E of even. And I asked whether she could read that, and she could not read then. So I realized, this child had not been taught how to decode. And she was 2 years away from secondary school. It was just abysmal. And I was so upset by it. On the way home from this school visit, I rang Ruth Miskin. I told her this story, and she said, because she's a lovely person, you should have her here. She's just brilliant. And she said, I'll come to the school and I'll teach that child. I'll have a reading in 6 weeks. So I rang the school and said, look, I'm very worried about that. I didn't get hold of the head. I just left a message with the secretary. And I said, look, I'm worried about this child. I've spoken to Ruth Miskin. She will do for free, give this child one-to-one tuition and getting a reading. Never heard back. I mean, I was so upset that I didn't hear back. I was just furious. And it just made me obsessive about phonics. I'm going to get this thing sorted out. I'm not having any more 9-year-old girls who can't read. Because it's her. I don't know what happened to her, but it will not be good. And we can't have that, because we do know from all the evidence that any child can be taught to read, regardless of their academic ability. Even children with very severe neurological conditions can be taught to read, and that's why I'm obsessed by it.
Notwithstanding that, there are many people many experts in education, universities, researchers, training providers that have not agreed on phonics or anything or many other things related to that. Is it just that they haven't found the Hirsch book on Amazon.com? What is it that's preventing them from being part of that solution?
I don't know, because the evidence is very compelling, but you are right, there are academics, I could tell you who they are now, I won't, but no, they know who they are, and who are, they call it barking at print, and they're very disparaging about it. And what they do is they conflate the issue of decoding with comprehension, and they are separate things. You have to teach the decoding first and fast, because reading, unlike walking and speaking, is not natural. It's a construct invented by mankind and humankind, and therefore it needs to be explicitly taught. And if you read watch these podcasts, Emily Hanford podcast, she makes the point that 60% of children need to be directly taught reading. So I think people have built a career on the whole language approach to teaching of reading, and they're not going to give up that whole career. It's a terrible thing to say, your whole career is being wrong. So you can see why they're resistant to it. But I think the main problem is they conflate comprehension, because reading isn't just decoding. Of course it's not. Once you can decode, you then need to improve your speed of reading, and then you need your vocabulary. You need to be read to every day in primary school, so you're more challenging books, so your vocabulary and knowledge increases. Of course, so all those things are important. But I contend that if you can't decode the squiggles, and Ruth Miskin does a very good lecture where she takes a language with a different alphabet and tries to get people to read it in the room, and you can't. And then she says, well, that word is door. And then she shows you another word, and says, what's that word then? And they can't read it. And so, well, that's what it's like if you don't teach children the sounds of the alphabet and how to blend them. So, I think they conflate comprehension with decoding is the problem.
You mentioned a little bit about the maths work that you did, and so how much would you say that everything you were learning about reading transferred to the way you were approaching maths, or did they not, in fact, have any relation?
There is. I mean, it may be that the math thing was peculiar to England, but we had a national numeracy strategy that was introduced, and they had some very peculiar. They were basically taking the approach you might take in mental maths, and they were turning it into a written method. So for long division, 12 into 257, they would go, 10 times 12, I know that's 120, so I'll take 120 from 257, so you're left with 137. You get another 10 12s into that. So you write 10 times 12 and 10 times 12 and 20. I mean, it's a very cumbersome approach, and you can see what that method is trying to do. It's trying to show how division is repeated subtraction. But that became the ultimate written method. And I remember visiting a school. I was taken there by civil servants to this school in Chiswick. I was told this was a really good school for maths. So I was introduced to this girl in year 6 who was the best pupil at the school in maths. So I asked her to do that calculation, and she did it like that. It took her 5 minutes when she could have been done in 2 minutes. And I realized then that there's a similar thing with long multiplication. They had the grid method. So they had 12 divided into 2 and 10, and then 7 and 50 and 200, and you multiply these all out in this massive grid, and then add it all up. Bonkers. I mean, this was happening in schools up and down the country, and you listen to lessons as well. It was all about sort of playing card games to try and inculcate understanding, and this was absolutely not in tune with any of the evidence, any of the approaches taken around the world, particularly not in East Asia. And so that's why we had to rewrite the curriculum and bring back, if you like, those traditional algorithms that are being used. We called it efficient written methods. And then we did a lot of exchanges of teachers with Shanghai teachers coming to England and vice versa. And we have completely, and teachers love it, by the way, when they see how effective those methods are in Singapore and Shanghai and South Korea when applied to English pupils in England. They love it. And the notion that it's sort of, that those methods only apply to children brought up in East Asia is just it's not the case.
I'm sure more than a few people would have said to you that focusing on, say, remembering your times tables, for instance, is just sort of old school. You don't need to do that anymore. We've got the calculators, all of that sort of thing. How do you convince people that actually knowing your timetables is somewhat valuable?
Yeah, when I first started thinking about these issues, I wasn't 100% sure. I used to ask mathematicians, professors of math, how important they were, and they said they were important. But the key issue is cognitive load, the John Sweller work and Daniel Willingham, who explained it to me, that, if you're doing a complex calculation, if you're trying to simplify a fraction, or an equation, or try to add and subtract and divide fractions, you can't be kind of busy working out what 7/6 are from first principles. You've got other stuff to do, and you end up sort of cognitive load theory. And maths is hard, and it's just made much, much easier if you just instantly know that 7/6 are 42 when you're doing it. So it's basically, I had an instinct anyway, because I learnt my tables in Canada as a pupil when I was 7, and I've used them most days ever since. And so I instinctively thought you need this stuff. But then it was very helpful reading Willingham and Sweller and Hirsch about why it was necessary. It has helped make the argument for introducing it.
And so you hadn't spoken about it a lot in your remarks earlier, but we have heard a little bit about it in the last few years, is the role that behaviour and bringing understanding about student behaviour and how to manage the classroom. How did you get that onto the radar too? Was that something that was led by, was that by parents that brought you there? Was it research? Obviously, it's not so much in the PISA tables. So what led you to see that as an inroad to, or a problem to solve as well?
Well, I mean, you did see it when I was visiting schools. You did see some sort of irritatingly bad behaviour that really annoyed me when I went around schools. But it was really, this issue is slightly different from the other issues because it really came from the profession more than from Michael Gove and me. And one of the great things about particularly Michael, he was very driven by the Academies programme and professional autonomy. And because we unleashed the profession to run their own profession, to run their own school, they then started talking about behaviour. And then we had people like Tom Bennett, Charlie Taylor, who was here yesterday, was our first behaviour czar. He was a head teacher of a school, special school for children with bad behaviour, and he was brilliant at that. And David Cameron and Michael Gove brought him in to help develop our behaviour policy, and then he was succeeded by Tom Bennett. So that really came from them, and then we saw it in Catherine's school, which is it's called the strictest school in England. But actually, you go there, and it's just lovely. It's not sort of some oppressive boys' borstal. It's just a lovely school where children study and work hard. The teachers are very supportive and loving. And those children come out, as I said, with 50% of their GCSE grades at grade 9 and 84% getting A's. It's just quite astonishing. But they had to get the behaviour right, because if your children aren't focused in the right mindset, they can't study. They're wasting vast amounts of time. It's also unpleasant for the children who are bullied. I mean, being in this big comprehensive school and being bullied every day of your life, we shouldn't have that. And we make it, the interesting thing, we make children, it's law, we pass a law, a correct law, making children go to school. And so we can't make them to go to school and then they get bullied every day. I mean, it's just wrong. So the behaviour is crucial, and I don't think we've done enough yet on behaviour. It's not 100% right by any means. But people like Tom and Charlie have done a great deal to improve it. And then examples like Michaela School that's spreading around the country is also seeing huge improvements.
Hi, Nick. I'm Susie Riddell. I'm the CEO of Social Ventures Australia, which is a charity here focused on reducing disadvantage. And I'm interested in your discussion about which bodies need to be arm's length and what needs to be brought into the political level, and particularly the Education Endowment Foundation as an evidence broker. So one of the roles we've played in Australia was bringing the Education Endowment Foundation approach to Australia with a small prototype that has then led to the creation of AERO, the Australian Education Research Organisation. An observation, though, is that it hasn't played the role of being the arm's length independent broker who can then engage in commentary kind of back with the political level about here's what the evidence says in terms of a larger national debate, which is something that seemed to play out in England, that they were playing part of that role. Here's what the evidence suggests, where there are gaps. Let's generate some more evidence with high quality randomised control trials and efficacy trials. So I'm interested in how, from a political perspective, you found it useful to have that entity being independent and arm's length, and what the next agenda might look like in terms of particularly the young people experiencing the most disadvantage. Love the focus that you had in your remarks about people experiencing disadvantage and how you've really lifted up the bottom in order to drive these incredible improvements. Thanks.
I mean, the EEF, thank you for the question. It's an important question. The EEF is I was worried about the quality of research. So was Michael Gove in the education world. And a typical research would be, we tried this thing, we surveyed the teachers, and 84% of teachers said it really worked, and there was a real buzz in the classroom. That isn't research. The research is we tried this thing in this school and we did not try this thing in this other school, and the school that did the thing outperformed the other school. That's research. And that's what Clap Manager is, and that's what the EEF does. And I've told something they do about our EEF does about 12% of the world's randomized controlled trials in education. It's brilliant, and it has a lot of cut through with the teachers. They look at the toolbox, and they what it shouldn't do, however, is write the curriculum, because that needs to be overseen by ministers and accountable to Parliament. And I get criticised for that, because who's Nick Gibb to write the curriculum? Or Michael Gove got particularly a lot of criticism with the history curriculum and the English curriculum. But the point is, we're accountable to Parliament, and those people in Parliament are accountable to their electorate. So I think it is important. And we had the position with the QCA, the Qualification Curriculum Authority, that really was out of control. I tabled a whole bunch of parliamentary questions to them, and I was hauled in by the chairman and said, "Why are you tabling all these parliamentary questions? We haven't got time to answer them." I was appalled by that attitude, and that was their attitude. So that's why they had to abolish them when we got in. But it is important that politicians do have a sign-off on what's in the curriculum, I think. And I don't just sit there and think, "Oh, what should be in it now?" You bring in the best people in the country to work out the history curriculum or the biology curriculum. But what you'd also do is you make sure that bad ideology isn't creeping in. And that's what we were able to prevent mostly.
Belinda.
Fantastic results in the UK, just so impressive. And it's just a standout having that chart up there. Well done, really, really well done, and obviously a lot of hard work. I'm Belinda Hutchinson. I'm previously the Chancellor of the University of Sydney, and I'm interested in how you worked with higher ed on initial teacher education. So we had a big review last year about initial teacher education, and one of the recommendations was around phonics, a lot about behavioural, in the classroom, behavioural improvement, all of those sort of things. But that is where the progressives are, particularly in the education departments, around adopting some of these new things, which are absolutely fundamental. So I'm interested in how you worked with higher ed to really improve initial teacher education. And my other question is around, how did you engage with the teacher unions around some of these changes? Because these are two of the very fundamental problems I think we face in Australia.
I mean, that's another brilliant question. I mean, just take the last bit first, unions. We had 6 unions, and it's now down to 4 with some mergers and things. But my view about the unions was that you should engage with them and talk as individuals, the general secretaries of each of the unions. I had lots of meetings with them in opposition and in government, so I got to know them really well, And what I just met them to discuss policy with them, and they came to the view that they didn't agree with anything that we did, but they understood the sincerity with which we wanted to do it. So they didn't query our motives. They just thought that this stuff wouldn't work. And I think that helped to take the kind of edge off the criticism. The other thing is we were doing other things. We were reforming the pensions and things that was slightly distracting their attention in the early years. But I just think you have to engage and have the honest debate with people who disagree with you, because I know ultimately we had a majority in the House of Commons, and we were going to push this thing through. And then on the higher ed, that was a challenge for me, I have to say. So during those opposition years and after, I did go and visit the education faculties. I remember going to Cambridge and others around the country, Birmingham and others. And the meetings were always the same. You go in, you'd be taken to a committee room with no windows, and they would talk at you for an hour and a half, and there'd be no discussion hardly. It's just hard to get any kind of discussion. And I think about the debate that's happening in England. England, by the way, not UK. They're not doing very well. But I think about the debate that's happening. It's happening with teachers. So I mentioned at the beginning the secret garden. That secret garden now has no fences or gates. It's open. And the people that are now in the secret garden wearing out the grass are teachers. They are blogging and writing and attending research ed conferences founded by Tom Bennett. So now they are in control of this debate. The education faculties of the universities, they weren't nowhere near this debate. They weren't interested in Sweller and Hirsch and Willingham and Siegfried Engelmann, they're not even on their reading lists. They're not, where were they in this debate? There's exciting debates happening in education in our country. It's not taking part there. And I made this point, I'm very cross with them. So what we try to do is bring control of teacher training to the school level through a thing called School Direct and school-centred initial teacher training. And that gave more power to the schools. But ultimately, trainee teachers want the postgraduate certificate of education, which is awarded by universities. And we are, through an extra parliament, we're trying to allow more people to award those qualifications. But that's a longer-term thing. So what we ended up doing, we left it really because it was so difficult. But we had to do it because we were busy training or putting all these resources into the knowledge rich and phonics. And meanwhile, the educational faculties were teaching not phonics, competence-based, and they talk about phonics and they go, oh, we've got to teach you this, but, it's not really what we think.
They haven't actually changed the initial teacher education programs yet.
Yes, we have. That was my prelude. So here comes the thing. So we left it till 2018 when we started doing this thing, and it was a brilliant. It wasn't my policy. It was one of our advisors called Rory Grubel. You should have him here. So we were worried about the teachers in the first 2 years of their careers. These are 23-year-olds thrust into a school, first flat, first job, and we said to them, oh, by the way, design your own lessons. The poor kids up till midnight every day, and then the 10% left. Probably 12% left, I think, probably. And then some more left the following year. So we had to do something about that to keep them in the profession. So we had the thing called the Early Career Framework. So this is mentoring and support and helping those young people get the knowledge they needed about how to control a classroom, how to manage behaviour, how to look after the curriculum, some ethics. So we had some standards we drafted with the help of the Education Endowment Foundation. Everything we did was signed off by them. And actually some of the things we wanted to do, they wouldn't sign off, and therefore we couldn't do them, which is a pity. But everything has to be evidence-based. So we did that. We put some money, 130 million a year, to free up some time. And so that landed well. And it was all, as I say, evidence-based. And very different from what they were getting at university. We then took that and we moved it upstream to the initial teacher training, and we call it the Core Content Framework. Same principles, same evidence base, based on signed off by the Education Endowment Foundation, and they were supposed to implement it. Ofsted then inspected against that framework, and some of them didn't get through that. But we were still suspicious that they weren't actually adhering to it. So we had a market review of the whole teacher training market, headed by Sir Ian Balcombe, a very successful head teacher. And he said that the universities had to reapply, had to be reaccredited to make sure that they were complying with the core content framework. So they went through that process. Oxford and Cambridge were furious because they said it interfered with their academic freedoms. We said, you can teach what the heck you like, but we are your customer and we want you to teach our trainees in accordance with what the evidence says. What do you do beyond that? It's up to you. So we weren't interfering with their freedom. And in the end, they caved and they went through the process and they got through. And then that was stage one. And then stage two, we said, right, you've signed up to all this thing. You've said that you're training teachers like this. Let's see the documentation, please. Let's see the materials that you are using. And a lot fell at that hurdle and they had to redo their thing. So we have challenged them and we have taken them on. But it just shows the importance of evidence. You've just got to base all of this policy on evidence. That's how you win these battles.
Thank you. Peter Shoker, we stage produced the Rock of Stepford and the Croc Festival in Outback, Australia, and also the Rock Challenge through the United Kingdom, from Isle of Wight up to Thursday High School in Scotland. So our experience the last 25 years has been in England, has been one of interest. The observation I have is, and we're experiencing it here in Australia, is many young people don't come to school all day, every day. And I'm wondering what tricks you have up your sleeve in England that changes that, because it's important that they find a way to get to school and to want to be at school. So school absenteeism is an issue for us in Australia, particularly in remote parts of the country, but also regional parts. And I just wonder if you've got some insights there you may be able to share.
That's a good question. I mean, there's pre and post-COVID. So pre-COVID, we were worried that too many parents were taking their children out during school term to go on holiday because they were cheaper. And we had to clamp down on that. And Charlie Taylor was our behaviour advisor, and first thing he did was say we've got to double the fines. So we doubled the fine, and we collected the money. And we were challenged by a man from the Isle of Wight in the High Court, and he lost. And we were able to pursue that policy, and it did work. And we found attendance rising. We changed the guidance to schools as well. We said that you don't have to, as a head teacher, you shouldn't be giving any leave of absence for going on holiday. That was not. You could only give leave of absence to pupils in exceptional circumstances, and exceptional circumstances did not include going on holiday. So that did have an impact on attendance. Then post-COVID, there's a much bigger set of challenges. I mean, children's mental health suffered during COVID, and people got used to not going to school. That whole contract that Amanda Spielman talks about between parents and school was kind of broken. A lot of parents still work from home, so when the child has a sniffle, it's easier to say, well, you can stay home. Whereas in the past, if both parents are working, you'll darn well go to school. I don't care if you've got pneumonia, you're going to go to school. Now they don't. So we've had to issue guidance to say, look, unless you have a fever, you should be going to school. But I think it is much more challenging, and we haven't cracked it. We've had all kinds of sort of panels of experts we had the Royal College of General Practitioners in Medicine. We had the head of the police service meeting the social worker, the head of the social worker profession. We would meet sort of every 6 weeks to work out what we could do in each of our sectors to try and get children to school. So the GPs would issue guidance to GP practice to say that children should be in school unless there's a fever, and so on. But it's a really intractable problem post-COVID, and we just have to just keep using those agencies and keep making the point that every day lost in school attendance has a direct impact on your final grades you're going to get in your exams and your future prospects. But I don't think I have all the answers. It's not easy.
Thanks. My name's Ian Gibb, and I'm a linguist from Macquarie University here in Sydney. And I've been very interested in the interface between our knowledge of language and how that knowledge interfaces with education in terms of student writing. You mentioned that you had done a little bit of work in writing. What did you find in your experience was an effective pedagogy, effective way of teaching children how to write?
And just over here as well.
Dr. Carolyn Curry, I've taught across many countries as well as at university for many years. What concerns me is how you keep ideology out of the schools. For instance, I find the children don't know about World War I or II. They have never heard the other arguments to what's happening with the oceans as opposed to the air. In other words, they're being indoctrinated in an ideology so that at the age of 2 in preschool, they're depressed. Later on, they don't seem to have any critical faculty. We did multiplication tables, addition tables, speed tables, etc., etc. I find the education standards appalling, and the education department at the universities are to blame. They often select who goes on the curriculum committees, and they don't want anyone who's not extreme left-wing. So how do you keep ideology out of this?
And so, Nick, one or both of those?
Yeah, I mean, everything I've been talking about today is about that. And I saw part of my role as a minister, half of my role was pushing the reform program forward. The other half was stopping bad things happening. And because a lot of things would emerge from within the department, it just had to be stopped. I mean, so ideology, it will always be with us, I'm afraid, and you just need to be able to identify it and to resist it, and to be able to resist it with the arguments made by those academics who've got the evidence to help with that I mentioned during my thing. On the writing, I mean, it's a very important issue. So with phonics, what we then did was we produced a reading framework that set out in much greater detail the things that schools should do in order to teach children to read in the most effective way. And then latterly, we took the same approach with producing a writing framework and then I left office in November before that whole piece of work was finished. But it is important, and you need to be able to. First of all, they need their grammar, and they need to know how to construct a sentence and proper syntax and so on. So that's, I mean, I'm struggling a little bit with this because it's kind of the area that we were focusing on as we came to the end of our period in office. But it is hugely important because you see the quality of writing, I mean, it is not good. And you obviously need knowledge, but you also need to know how sentences are constructed. You need to have that kind of meta language of how to put these things together. Ruth Miskin talks about children sort of almost verbally discussing the story they're going to tell. They struggle to know what to write, as well as being taught how to construct a properly constructed sort of sentence and paragraph. So they need all that mechanical skill and knowledge, as well as knowing what to write. I believe I put into the curriculum dictation as well, because I used to love dictation as a kid. I hated comprehension, but I loved dictation, and I think that's important because children just need to practice these how sentences are constructed and so on. On languages, just going to touch on that since you're a linguist, and we're terrible in England and in the UK. We are the worst. We're at the bottom of the European Languages League because if you just speak, I suspect Australia is the same. You just speak English loudly enough and people will understand. And it is the lingua franca, isn't it? So why would you bother learning a foreign language? But it is a disgrace that we don't do it. And then in 2004, we stopped it being compulsory to 16. It's now compulsory to 14, but not 16, which means that the numbers taken in the GCSEs in foreign languages plummeted from 80% down to 40 overnight, essentially. We've tried to bring that back through the performance measure called the EBAC. And I also asked Ian Borkham. We use Ian Borkham for everything. He's a brilliant man. You should have him here, he's a linguist. And we asked him to look at how languages are taught in schools in England. And it's very badly taught. It's taught almost like a Berlitz guide, rather than getting to the grammar and the vocabulary and the pronunciation. And we've tried to, so he did a report for us. That called the Review of Pedagogy, about how to, because I think children don't like studying foreign languages because it's really too hard for them. But if it's taught properly, it's not too hard. It's like anything if it's taught well. So we're trying to improve the way it's taught, as well as giving incentives to schools to keep on teaching foreign languages. But we only went from 40% to 46% in our years in office. So there's more to do.
And Nick, did you have a final word of advice for Australia's policymakers?
My advice is don't compromise. I mean, I wish I hadn't compromised. People would be surprised to hear this. People in England would be surprised to hear this. I compromise all the time. And I wish I hadn't, really, because if you know what's right, you darn well do it, really. And it's so tempting, and I know you probably feel this, John, it's so tempting if you're a minister to compromise, to just smooth things. But every time you compromise on something you know is right, you are just nicking a little bit of points from these international league tables. But more importantly, you are reducing the life chances of a few kids here and a few kids there, or maybe 100,000 kids here, 100,000 kids there. So if you've got the evidence and you know you're right, it's just worth putting up with the flack to get it done. Because children will benefit, and the economy will benefit, and the country will benefit if you just do that.
That's all we have time for today. Thank you everyone that's here today. Now, for decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice, working tirelessly to deliver evidence-based public policy, especially in the critical area of education. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. CIS relies solely on the generosity of people like you to help us advance our cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.